Hello, this is Derek from One Over Tea. Welcome back to another episode of Tea Soup, a podcast all about tea culture, life in modern China, and Chinese tea. I'm your host, Derek Poskin. I've been living in China since 2016, and I've been drinking, buying, and selling Chinese tea for the past decade. So, pop on that kettle, heat up your teaware, and let's get this session started. Alright, so in this episode of Tea Soup, we're going to tackle another type of tea. We've already talked about the Biluochuan, we've talked about Longjing Dragonwell, those two green teas. We've talked about Chaozhou and the Dansong Oolong, and of course, we had that 6-episode session on white tea. Today, we're switching gears to another type of tea. This is a tea that is probably one of the most popular teas in the West as far as the boutique tea market goes, something that I've seen lately. It's everywhere. It's called Pu'er tea. And if you don't know what Pu'er tea is, get ready, because this is going to be a deep dive into the history of Pu'er tea. This type of tea, the region it comes from, because it comes from Yunnan, and Yunnan is one of the most special provinces in all of China. It's so fascinating. I've been there 6 or 7 times, and I really love it. It's so cool, and I'll tell you exactly why I love it so much, but this episode here actually took me quite a while to do the right research for, because Pu'er is really popular in the West and in China, and there's a lot of misinformation out there about it because it became so incredibly popular recently. And then people are, historicizing things quite a bit, and so it took a while to separate fact from reality, what's important, what's not important, because the Pu'er that we're drinking today and going to be talking about later in these episodes is not the historical Pu'er tea, not necessarily. And so I'll kind of get into exactly why I say this later. If you've listened to the other episodes of Tea Soup, you know every time I talk about a new type of tea, I like to go as far back as I can into the history, the legends surrounding it, and its origin. Usually I find some pretty decent origin myths, some historical references about this tea in certain times. With Yunnan Pu'er, I found a little bit of historic reference and then a whole lot of very different origin myths. These myths, I don't even think that any of them are real. I think somebody just was like, I want to make a little myth about Pu'er. I've never heard these myths from really anyone who's talking about Pu'er tea. Is just researching, what are there any consistent myths for Pu'er? And I found, a good dozen. And so what I did is I picked a few, and we'll talk about them later. But if you're curious about the other origin myths, as I mentioned earlier, I've done white tea, I've done 2 different types of green tea, the Biluochuan and Longjing, and I've done the Dansong Oolong tea. My formula for covering different types of teas so far is pretty simple. I talk about the history of it, I talk about my sourcing trips there, I talk about the making of it, and then I talk about how to enjoy it and the drinking of it. And so if you consider this will be the first part of the Pu'er episodes. Next, I'll talk about sourcing, then I'll talk about making, then I'll talk about enjoying, drinking, storing, etc. This episode might actually be a little too long, so I might split it up between ancient history and modern history for the Pu'er, because I was going pretty deep into this. So this one will be a little more of a information-based episode, and the next couple episodes will be more fun sourcing trips and stuff like that. All right, so let's get into it. So Pu'er comes from Yunnan. Pu'er tea comes from the province of Yunnan. Yunnan is located in the southwest of China, and let's kind of talk about it, because Yunnan, as I mentioned earlier, is an incredible province, one of the most biodiverse provinces, one of the most ethnically diverse provinces. It has, I think, 26 of the 56 minority groups live in Yunnan, China alone. This is a single province out of China's 23 provinces. And so if you look at the map, we'll start there. If you zoom out of China, you look at, down where Guangzhou, Hong Kong is, and you keep going left, you'll go down to this little dip. And when you get to that little dip, that is where Yunnan dips into right on the borders of Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar. And this is a border kingdom. It's massive and has, like I mentioned, an incredible amount of diversity. And I'm going to get into the history, the geographic history of this region, because there's a lot to be said about Yunnan and the origin of tea itself. A lot of people think tea originated in this region, which, when we talk about it, it doesn't seem very strange to say that, yeah, tea probably did originate in this Yunnan Sichuan region and then was spread out to the west or to the east, from the west east into China. So to do this, I'm going to have to go back further in time than I ever had in any Tea Soup episode in the past. I'm going to go back 65 million years. And this is when we're talking about tectonic plates here. This is when the Indian Ocean tectonic plate collided with the Eurasian plate, and you might know what happened here. This gave rise to the Himalayan mountains, and this is the world's largest mountain range, still growing. And you see here, caught in the southeastern edge of this collision, is Yunnan. And so Yunnan has this incredible rise to it, and there's this fault line that kind of splits Yunnan in half. This is called the Red River Fault Line, and it goes vertically from the north to the south. And you'll see this huge difference between the different climate zones in the west and in the east, and it's because the west was pushed up by that Himalayan rise, and the east was kind of pushed up in a different way with the Guizhou Plateau. And you'll see different climate zones there, which again just goes to explain the different ethnic and cultural and biodiverse differences between these two regions. Now, altitudinally, wow, what word is that? Speaking of altitude, when you go from the northwest of Yunnan, you're up about 4,000 meters on average. The highest mountain in this region is part of the Meili Shuishan Range, which is the tail end of the Himalayas. And this highest mountain, I believe it's called the Kawagebo, if I'm saying that right, or the Kawakarpo. It's a transliteration from the traditional Tibetan language, transliterated into Chinese and then translated into English. And so I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce this mountain, but it is a sacred mountain. It stands over 7,000 meters tall, perpetually covered in snow, and it's made pilgrimage. Tibetan people make pilgrimage there all the time and walk around this entire mountain. And for me, I've actually been there a few times. I've been to this mountain 3 times to see the morning sunrise on it and to hike to the kind of foothills of it. And I'll talk about this later. This is in Yubong, in northern Yunnan, in the region of Dechin. From the Feilaisa temple is the jumping off point, but it's a really, really beautiful hike, and it's just, I'll talk about it later just because I go there so much. I love it so much. So what I'm talking about here, though, is in the northwestern region of Yunnan, the average elevation is about 3,500 meters to 4,000 meters, the highest point 7,000, and then as you go southeast, the elevation slowly drops. And what is happening here is you get a huge amount of snow melt, glacial melt, springs, rivers just starting to rush down through Yunnan. And so I want you to imagine incredible amounts of just rapid, foaming rivers, powerful rivers that deafen you with the sound, waterfalls as these things drop off mountains and cliff sides and down plateau edges. And one of the most incredible ones is the Leaping Tiger Gorge. This area of Yunnan creates some of the world's deepest gorges. And by that I mean the difference between where the river is to where the mountains are and how close it is. It feels like you're just looking down and down and down into, a river that's just a tiny hair, 1,000 meters below you. And the Leaping Tiger Gorge is where the Jinsha River just cuts through these mountains. And these mountains are just absolutely beautiful. This is the Yulong Shuishan, I believe, or the Haba Shuishan, which is just incredible tall mountains, probably like 5,000 meters high. And then the river is something like, 3,000 something meters below it. Okay, I took a break and I just checked those numbers. Yeah, from the peak of the mountain top, and this is the Yulong Shuishan, the Jade Dragon Snow Mountain, and the Haba Shuishan, the Haba Snow Mountain. Their peaks are about 5,400 meters, and then down 3,900 meters from the peak is to the river. And so that huge amount of difference is just right there. And also, what's really cool is this is the Jinsha River, which is up in the northwestern area of Yunnan and will slide down through Yunnan, flow down through Yunnan. And then eventually it takes a hairpin turn and goes back up through mainland China, and it becomes the Yangtze River, which is, if you know anything about Chinese history, Chinese culture, the Yangtze River is the cradle of the Chinese civilization. This is the lifeblood, and all the oldest Chinese civilizations were built on the banks of the Yangtze. Of course, this is as we get further east, but it's really cool to see it in its raw power here in northwestern Yunnan before it goes out east. Anyways, I've hiked the Tiger Leaping Gorge 2 times, and it's one of my absolute favorite places in the world because you get to see the different cultures in northwestern Yunnan. You get to see this wild biodiversity here and this sense of just primal, raw, elemental nature because everything here is just massive. The mountains are huge, the skies are huge, the rivers are deep and powerful, and you just feel really small when you're hiking this wild terrain. It's really, really lovely. Now, getting back into the incredible biodiversity found in this region is typically called the Huangdong Mountain Range, the Hengduan Mountain Region, and it alone is home to over half of China's total biodiversity. That's 19,000 different species of plants in this region. I think I saw there are over 400 different species of just orchids here. This is why Yunnan is called the flower capital of the world. You can see how many different types of species and all of the ancestors of a lot of other plants come from this region. And how is this possible? Why is this possible? It really comes back to that dramatic altitude change that you see in this region. Because really, if you're looking at China, if you're looking at Yunnan in particularly, it's essentially one big mountain. It goes from down in the southeast, almost like sea level, all the way up to an average of like 4,000 meters in the northwest. And one thing I remember from studying biology in university is the different climate zones are related to different changes in, latitude. So going from the equator up to the polar region, you get different bands surrounding the globe, and these are your different climate regions. This creates the different biodiversity seen in a lot of the world. What another way to look at this is when you go up in altitude, these bands are almost identical, where you get different climate zones at different altitudes. And so when you get a whole province that goes from, sea level all the way up to 4,000 stable altitude, you get so many different bands of climate zones. So if you look at the climate zones available in mainland China that go from south up to north, this essentially reflects Yunnan to a T. So anything that can grow in mainland China can grow in some place in Yunnan. Now, I would love to get more into the biology of this, but I'm not a biologist. I am still no expert. I have a friend named Steven who just raves about the biodiversity here in Yunnan. He always wants to go to the Hengduan Mountains and just see for himself the ancestors of a lot of these modern species of plants, because this area is that ancient birthplace of a lot of these different plants, trees, fauna, species of fauna, and stuff like that. And so I would love to go into a deeper dive with him or somebody more detailed into biology and just talk about loosely tangential tea topics, but that would be for another episode, not for right now. Let's get back into our overview of tea in Yunnan and Pu'er. So we just spent a lot of time talking about the biological diversity of Yunnan, but let's anthropomorphize this a little bit and talk about the different types of human societies in this region. As I mentioned earlier, Yunnan is home to 26 different ethnic minorities, where China only has about 56. And for me, this is really, really noticeable. Seeing not only the fact that, over half of all the different types of plants, fish, birds, and animals all live in Yunnan, also maybe potentially half of the different ethnic minorities all live in this single province. And for me, when I'm traveling through mainland China, a lot of it, a whole lot of it feels like a monoculture. It feels like there's the one minority, the Han minority, and it's the Han culture. And every now and then you get weird pockets of like, oh, this is a little different. When I'm traveling in Yunnan, I feel so different. There's so many different cultures everywhere. They're mixing together and they're still living in a lot of these traditional ways and doing a lot of the traditional things that they would do. Now, while traveling through China, almost every city and every region, they'll have their own special food, their own special drink, maybe their own special tea, their own alcohol, and certain customs, but they're still very similar. When you get to Yunnan, things get so different. And I've been to Yunnan, I think, about 6 times the past 7 years. I really, really love the province. Probably one real main reason is probably because of the elevation. It always just feels a little more clean, a little more clear up at 3,000 meters or something like that. And what I usually do is I'll go down south for the tea in spring, and then I'll go up north for hiking in summer because when I go up north, it's just stunning. As I said, it's the tail end of the Himalayas. The super high altitude makes everything really cool. You feel really close to the sun and the big sky. As I said, that elemental primal feeling about you feel so small, the world's so big. But then also, what's really, really cool is the different types of cultures up there. I usually really like to go to Shangri-La, which is Shangri-La. It wasn't always named that. It was renamed that kind of recently. So it's the village of Shangri-La. And then that's in the Dechin region. I mentioned the Feilai Se. And the Feilai Se is a small temple that's in that northern region. And it overlooks the Meili Shuishan. A lot of people go there to see the Meili Shuishan mountain range, which I believe is a transliteration of a Tibetan word that means the mountains of medicinal herbs. And this just goes to clarify the fact that like everyone knows there's a huge amount of biodiversity in this region. But as I mentioned there, that's a transliteration of a Tibetan word. A lot of the culture up in this northwestern area of Yunnan is heavily Tibetan influenced. It feels like you're in Tibet. The different building structures, the languages, the styles, the dancing in the squares, the music people listen to, the foods they eat, it feels like you've left China. It's really, really dramatically different. And like I said, I've been to this hike to the foothills of the Meili Shuishan. This is the Yubong village. And when I first started hiking Yubong, I've been there 3 times, I believe, maybe 4. There were no roads into it. And it was like the only way to get in is like an 8-hour hike over a few mountain ridges down into the valley. I think I tried to say village there and then tried to change it to valley at the last minute. Anyways, it's a really, really beautiful place. This Yubong, it's a valley in between all of these mountains, and they're all snow peaked, and there are trails that go up to like the base of waterfalls, the base of glaciers, up to lakes on the top of the mountains. I remember hiking one all the way up to like almost 5,000 meters, like 4,700, 4,800 meters. And there's just this, above the tree line, everything gets silent. There are no birds. There are no bugs. The wind comes, but there are no trees for it to moan against. And the water and the mist, and there's this lake up there that's ice cold but not frozen, and nothing lives in it, and it's just really eerie. I remember hearing like a rock fall off of a cliffside, and it just echoed in this like alien landscape. It's really bizarre hiking it, but very, very interesting. There was another moment I hiked to the base of a sacred waterfall, and this is also in Yubong, and it's a place of pilgrimage. So a lot of Tibetan people will walk there. Sometimes you'll see the people praying every step of the way. You'll see a lot of these stone stacks. You get to the base of the waterfall, and a lot of the Tibetan pilgrims will run through the waterfall. And this is like a really terrifying waterfall. It's falling from several hundred meters high. And if you get up close, there's thunder. It's smashing the ground. It's ice cold. It's kind of terrifying. And so you really get that feeling of sublimity when you're running through it. And I was there looking at it, taking photos, and this old Tibetan lady is holding a baby all swaddled, and she looks at me and she just like hands me the baby, and we speak a little bit in the Chinese, and she's like, oh, she's going to run through the waterfall. And so she gives me her little baby that I'm holding as she runs through this sacred waterfall, and somebody nearby is singing prayers to it. And I'm just like, this is quite an experience here. And it really has that feeling of wonder of being close to something sacred up there. Anyways, this is the really thick Tibetan culture up in the northwest. And again, let's take the rivers down to the south because that's where we want to go for the tea. We want to take these rivers down past where Kunming would be latitudinally speaking, and we want to get down to Xishuangbanna, we want to get to Linsang. And so as we go down, we see this less and less Tibetan influenced culture, and you see more other nationalities, more other ethnic groups. And a lot of this, if you're thinking of this whole region, it's close to Myanmar, it's close to Laos, it's close to Vietnam, it's close to Thailand. And so as you get south, you get a little more of this kind of Southeast Asian influences in the cuisine, in the styles of architecture, in the styles of temples, in the style of Buddhist worship. And all of this, it starts changing and becomes much more this like tropical jungle kind of vibe. One thing about Yunnan that's consistent and inescapable is just the sheer size of everything. Even from Kunming, the capital city of Yunnan, it takes about 5-6 hours by car or train to get even close to one of the nearest tea regions. Even driving, taking a bus, taking a train, you'll feel like you're just traveling forever and ever through this massive landscape. Whereas, it's not like Suzhou and Bilochun where it's, 45 minutes from the city, you're in the tea fields. It's not like Hangzhou where the tea fields are part of the city. Hangzhou's a huge city, Suzhou's a huge city. In these tea regions in Yunnan, you're so far away from the world of society. It's kind of bizarre. They have a saying that always makes me a Chinese chengyu, an idiom. I always think of when I get down to Yunnan. It's Tian Gao Huang Di Yuan, which is the heaven is high and the emperor is far away. And this is the idea of like you're in a border kingdom. No one's watching. The laws are the laws of the land. There's a little bit of banditry in this ideology, but again, you really feel like you're apart from the world out here. One of my favorite things that they do really, really well in the south of Yunnan is their mi xian. Mi xian is just rice noodles, and it's the best breakfast I've ever had in China. It's just a big bowl of noodles and a type of broth, and you can just pick your different types of savory toppings that you want. And when I go to Yunnan, I eat it maybe at least once a day, sometimes twice a day. It's always agreeable for me, and I can't have enough of it. Every time I go back, I just really, really want the mishan, and of course, the tea. So let's get into the tea. As we've gone south from the northwest of Yunnan, we start hitting these regions. We'll hit the 4 main production regions for Yunnan tea. And this is going from northwest down to southeast. That's Baoshan, Linsang, Pu'er, and Xishuangbanna. Now, one interesting thing about that, we're talking about Pu'er tea, and one of these places that makes tea is called Pu'er. So let's talk about why that is real quick. Now, first off, Pu'er is typically romanized in the old Wade Giles outdated system of romanization as Pu apostrophe ERH. In Chinese, in pinyin, it's usually just Puer, sometimes Pu apostrophe ER. And the idea here is when you have the 2 vowels next to each other, you kind of have to split it up somehow. So it's 2 different words, pu and pu'er. And to any students of Chinese out there, these are both third tones. So it's pu'er. And then when you have 2 third tones together, it usually turns the first one into a second rising tone. So pu'er, or the first one into a second rising tone. Anyways, Pu'er, we just found out, is not just the type of a tea, the name of a type of a tea, but it's also the name of a place. It's a city. It's a region. And I met somebody from Pu'er City, and he was really proud of it. He was my driver in Xishuangbanna. I was visiting a friend down there in Menghai. And so I get into the airport in Jinghong, and I call this guy, and he's driving me into Xishuangbanna, and he is amazing. He just tells me everything about his life. He's super talkative. He's initially from Pu'er, but he moved down to the Menghai region because now there's a little more business being done in Menghai. You can find a little better business here. He has 7 brothers and a sister. He's got a 94-year-old father that he takes care of, and they all live together in Menghai, but they all used to live together in Pu'er. And again, he's told me so many times, Pu'er, This the tea was named after where I'm from. And I was like, interesting, but why? Because currently Pu'er is not the coolest, hippest place for Pu'er tea. It's actually down south in Xishuangbanna is where you get some really cool adventurous teas. Linsang still has some really nice teas like that King and Queen, the Shigui, and the Bingdao. Then down south you get the Laobanjiang in like the Xishuangbanna region. But Pu'er, you don't get a whole lot of really famous villages, famous mountains there now. And so the question is, why would you name the tea after Pu'er? And so this gets into the history of Pu'er, this type of tea. Because if we look about the type of tea names in other places, sometimes the name of the region it comes from is added into the name, like the Huangshan Maofeng, like the Taiping Hokui, that's from like the Lake Taiping. Anji Bai Cha, which is a green tea, not a white tea, from Anji, which is a small village. But one thing we don't see is it's not just called Anji. It's not just called Huangshan. It's called Huangshan Maofeng. So why is it just called Pu'er? This kind of gets back into the history of Pu'er. When did it first kind of come around? The whole region of Pu'er was a sort of production hub for tea back in the Ming and the Qing dynasty. And if you remember, the Ming and Qing dynasty is really the heyday of modern tea when you're doing these shelf-stable, wok-fired, kill-green type teas. Now, digging deeper into the etymological origin of Pu'er, we can see that it has its roots back in the Yuan dynasty. So even before the Ming, before the Qing, in the Mongol dynasty, when the bricks were being pressed and exported all across the Tibetan steppe to the Mongol region, stuff like that, the region here was called Pu'er, and it's been changed to Pu'er in the Ming and Qing. But this is what would get stamped into the cakes. And so the cakes that would get exported would just have, would have Pu'er on it. And in time, it's very difficult to separate the fact that, no, Pu'er is not the name of the tea, it's the name of the place. It eventually just became one and the same. Now, one interesting point of contention that I had to research is that the name Pu'er has two different names. So the region here that was Pu'er in the Yuan dynasty, the Ming dynasty, the Qing dynasty, in the Maoist era, after the communist victory in 1950, they renamed Pu'er and called it Sumao. And so then from 1950 up until 2007, Pu'er was called Sumao. And then in 2007, with the popularity of tea, which we'll talk about later, they changed it back to Pu'er, just to kind of bring back some of the former glory they had as the Pu'er tea begins this meteoric upswing in popularity. So if you ever hear people talking about Sumao, just know that it's the same place as Pu'er, that region, that city in Yunnan. Now that gets the general origin of the name according to, some reliable historical records. I can agree with it. Okay, Yuan dynasty, the origins, the popularity of Ming and Qing, and the changing of the name to Sumao and the communist victory in the Maoist era, and then back to Pu'er once it starts getting popular. As is my style with these histories of tea, I want to go back and see if there are any ancient myths about this tea. How do the people kind of put it into their society? How do the people talk about the origins of this tea? And so I'm going to dig deep and see. I found a few different legendary origins. I kind of talked to you, I found a whole bunch, but I don't know which ones are canon because I've never heard any of these. If I talk to anyone from Yunnan, they don't really have a myth of tea. They'll tell me more the historical facts, where it's like, oh yeah, it was just exported in the Mongol dynasty and became really popular, but they won't say oh, this one person invented Yunnan Pu'er tea and stuff like that. So doing some research, I found a lot of Chinese stories about tea culture, and they're doing what's really common. I talked about this in the first episode of Tea Soup, in the second episode as well. What they're doing is they're trying to take something that already exists and sanctify it with ancient history. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to create mythologies that kind of say yes, Pu'er tea has been around forever. It was touched by this great figure and given to us by this great character. And that's why it's so beautiful. And we see this, with Shen Nong discovering tea in the ancient history. We see Bodhidharma to the Buddhist cutting off his eyelids, sanctifying tea. In the Dragon Well and the Below Chun origin, we see the same Qing Dynasty Emperor Qianlong. And again, this emperor makes another appearance in the history of Dansong Oolong. And so we see these really famous people around the origin myths of tea, and these are the ones that I really just write off. I'm like, these are probably not accurate. What they're trying to do is they're just trying to touch this tea with the history of a famous person and make that tea famous. Yeah, so we'll look at one of these for the origins of Pu'er. So in Pu'er, they don't use one of the emperors, as I mentioned earlier, Tiangao Huangdi Yuan. Huangdi means the emperor. The emperor is far away. What they do bring up is another character from myth. This is from the Three Kingdoms period. He's a famous general, and he's called Zhuge Liang. Zhuge Liang was a famous general and tactician in the Three Kingdoms period, and that's around 200 AD. Three Kingdoms period was interesting because it was definitely like similar to the Warring States period, where they have just so much fighting, so much infighting. Like China had just been unified and is now almost falling apart, and so it's a point of really tense social circumstances where a lot of really famous people kind of came to the surface. And so you get another famous general, Cao Cao. If you've ever had General Cao's chicken, this is the general it was named after, Cao Cao. In China, they have a saying called Shou Cao 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 Dao, which is like, speak of Cao Cao and Cao Cao is there. You know, it's essentially speak of the devil. And this is just because Cao Cao was such another incredible military genius, and he was faced off against Zhuge Liang in the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. And this book is one of the 4 Chinese classics. There's The Water Margin, Dream of the Red Chamber, Journey to the West, Romance of the Three Kingdoms. And a lot of the stuff that happens in it is probably not real history. I mean, there's the general seed of real history, and then a lot of these stories are likely fictitious. And so I'll talk about some of the stories so you just get a feeling for who these guys are, because they're great characters. So there's one thing about Zhuge Liang. Zhuge Liang was a legalist. So legalist is, you know, if you consider like Confucianism, legalism, Taoism, Buddhism, these kinds of things, there are a lot of different ways to say, oh, you should rule an empire like this. Legalists were a little not tyrannical, but very draconian in their punishment of laws, in the way they hold their states and stuff like that. A lot of control. And so in the Three Kingdoms period, Zhuge Liang had the nickname of the Sleeping Dragon, which is a really cool nickname, in my opinion. I would love to get a nickname like that. And one of my favorite stories that really illuminates his character is his use of the 30-second stratagem of the 36 military stratagems. And this is a really cool stratagem. It's called the Empty City. And just to give you a glimpse of who this guy was, like, let me tell you the story. So the story goes like this. Zhuge Liang had retreated to a fort city after a defeat in the field, and he only had a small group of surviving soldiers with him. The enemy learned where he had routed and came to besiege his city. And Zhuge Liang knew that he didn't have time to prepare the forces to defend the city. He didn't have enough time to resupply. He only had a small company, and he employed the stratagem of the empty city. And so what he did is he had all his soldiers dress in common clothing, gave them all brooms and had them sweep the streets, had some people set up stands for selling flowers, selling food and stuff like that, and he commanded all the gates and doors in the city to be flung open. And he even sat on the main guard tower with 2 pages, and he was playing the old Chinese instrument, the guqin. And so when the enemy arrives, the opposing general, who knows Zhuge Liang is an incredible tactical genius, and he just sees this empty city, this really peaceful thing, and he's like, oh no, I'm not going in there. That's definitely a trap. He's definitely got this crazy ambush. I'm smarter than this Zhuge Liang. I'm not going in here. And so he retreats. and he gets a larger force, to get a larger force and conquer the city. And Zhuge Liang, therefore, had just defended the city with a handful of soldiers and a guqin. And so the only reason this worked is because Zhuge Liang's character is very serious, and he would never play these massive gambits. But he knows he can do it one time and it'll work. So It's just really cool seeing these old histories and these old figures. There's another cool one about Cao Cao. He was fighting Cao Cao, and then Zhuge Liang ran out of arrows, and they were across like a river from each other. And Zhuge Liang sent a bunch of boats across, halfway across the river with like straw men, like stuffed dummies and stuff like that. And Cao Cao's army just peppers them with arrows, and then they pull all the boats back. Zhuge Liang pulls all the boats back, takes all the arrows, and resupplies his army. And so there's just like a bunch of silly stories like this, which, they might have a seed in truth, but are likely just over exaggerations of these people's characters. So yeah, I bring up all of these stories as a point to be like, okay, like when I see that Pu'er was discovered by Zhuge Liang, I smile and I shake my head. I'm like, okay, I'm going to get a huge grain of salt and look at this myth. And so the myth of the discovery of Pu'er goes like this. So back in the Three Kingdoms period, right around 200 AD, after the creation of China, we know as the Qin, and the subsequent sundering of the dynasty and the dissolution of it, Zhuge Liang was leading an army against the barbaric tribes in the jungles of northern Myanmar. There, the tropical weather, it's so hot, plagues of mosquitoes, and his soldiers quickly began to get sick, diseased in the camps. And then Zhuge Liang requested the help of local doctors, the locals and stuff, who lived there, and they created a bunch of wild tea medicine for the soldiers to drink. And as soon as the soldiers drank it, they were cured, and Zhuge Liang, being a smart man, took some of the seeds, brought them back to what is now western Sichuan, and planted them there. And thus, Zhuge Liang is sometimes heralded as the father of Pu'er. Supposedly there are some statues about him doing this in Yunnan and Sichuan and stuff like that. Now, this myth has some interesting similarities to myths we've seen before. And I know I've mentioned the Buddhist use of Bodhidharma, the secular use of Shen Nong to sanctify tea, the historic figure touching tea and making it famous. So that at least is par for the course when it comes to these myths, these origin myths for Chinese tea. Another thing we've seen before is this idea of tea as medicine. We see this with Shen Nong. We see this in white tea and the origin of white tea. Tea was being used as medicine and then became more and more popular. Another interesting thing, and I'm going to take a step outside of China here, the structure of this is almost a Promethean myth of delivering fire to the world of mortals. Something taken from one world and brought back into another. And so Zhuge Liang has to leave his own society, go to the very, very fringes, the borders of the world, and find tea and then bring it back to civilization. Another seed, no pun intended, of this myth is the fact that Zhuge Liang's old province that he worked for, he was the general of, was Shu. And that's kind of loosely Sichuan and Yunnan now, and famous for its original production of bricked tea to export over the Himalayas. It's credited as the birthplace of tea in general, and you see Zhuge Liang bringing the seeds back to that Sichuan region. The second myth I want to talk about still takes place in kind of the old era, but not so far back. And so Zhuge Liang, that's 200 AD. This is the Three Dynasties period, and they eventually fast forward about 1,000 years, and you'll get to where this next myth kind of starts taking place, maybe 1,500 years even. This myth takes place in the Qing Dynasty, and this is really going to be all about the origin of the name of Pu'er and the origin of the shape of it, and how this tea came to be so popular in the north of China, in Beijing and in the court and stuff like that. So, as I said, this myth takes place in the Qing Dynasty, and it features a prominent emperor that we've seen before, the Bilo-Truan era, the Dragonwell era. This is the famed Qianlong emperor. And so the story goes like this. One famous tea house in Pu'er City was elected to bring the tribute tea to the emperor in Beijing. After the Ming Dynasty, tribute tea, loose leaf tea, became really popular ever since Zhu Yuanzhang created that edict and had his tribute tea. And so now tea needs to be brought all the way from Yunnan to Beijing. And this is about as far as you can get from one side of China to the other side. And naturally, this is ancient times, so the path from Yunnan to Beijing is long, arduous, maybe taking up to 3 months. This envoy in the story, he was a little less than vigilant, allowing the tea to kind of get loose, allowing the tea to get moist, to get wet, storing it in these crushed bags that, got too warm in the sultry summer months, so that by the time they arrived in Beijing, he opened up the tea and it was dark, pressed, and just covered in small frost or mold. And so the envoy sees this. He's like, oh my gosh, this is the tea, the tribute tea. I've ruined it. I'm probably going to be executed. And so he's like at the tavern drinking away like the last moments of his life. And the head of the tavern, the tavern keeper, is like, you know what? Let's just try this tea and see how it is. And he tries it and he's like, wow, this is fantastic. He really, really likes it. And he gives the guy the confidence to bring it to the Qianlong Emperor. And the Qianlong liked it so much as well. And then he asks the aide, like, where's this tea come from? And what is this tea? And the aide doesn't have any information on the tea other than it came from Pu'er. And he just goes, oh, it's Pu'er. So that's an interesting myth that does a whole lot of legwork, I think. It tries to cover a whole lot of why the tea is called this, why it looks like this, why did it get fermented, why did it get aged, and stuff like that. And so I think it's a really, really interesting myth that takes a while to unpack. So it definitely seems a little confused, and is certainly created after the fact. One big red flag here is it seems to be trying to explain why Pu'er is pressed, and says like, oh, this happened in the Qing dynasty from like a absent-minded envoy, but we know from Lu Yu, we know from history, his actual historical records, tea was compressed all the way since the Tang dynasty. And so the compression and the shape of the Pu'er tea cake is nothing new. And so the fact that this myth tries to explain, oh, that was the origin of it pressing, kind of makes all the other stuff a little less, less persuasive, I would say. Another thing about this is it tries to invent an excuse for cooked pu'er, essentially. It's like, oh, this is how the pu'er was fermented back in the ancient days, but we know that the creation of pu'er, of cooked pu'er, came around in the 1973 in the Kunming number 1 tea factory. And so that's actual, not even ancient historic facts. This is modern facts. And so this story kind of, maybe they're talking about how pu'er was intended to be drunk as a fermented, darker type of tea that we see in Hong Kong. But still, that's 1950s history. That's not ancient history. And so putting it all the way back in the Qing dynasty is going a little too far, in my opinion. One thing we see in common with this myth and a lot of the other myths is the accidental naming of the pu'er tea. This idea of accidents. This whole story is all about this accident happened, this accident happened, this accident happened. So the shape of the cake, accident. The fact that it was fermented, accident. The name of pu'er itself, accident. This reminds me a little bit of the dragon well myth where Qianlong accidentally pressed the dragon well in a book, and that creates the flat shape for the tea. One thing that I do really like about this myth here, that it did do a good job, was in actual historical facts of China, the Qing dynasty, the court of the Qing dynasty, had a taste for Yunnan tea. They really liked pu'er tea. And so ever since the Qing dynasty, they were getting imported Yunnan tea, pu'er tea consistently. And so this myth actually does kind of talk about how the tea was brought across all the way from Yunnan into the capital and how it became a scholar tea in the capital city. Okay, now that we've broken up some of these old myths for the origin of tea, the origin of Yunnan tea, of pu'er tea, let's look and see if we can find any factual evidence of it. First thing I would like to do is go back to the idea that Yunnan itself is incredibly biodiverse, the most biodiverse province in all of China. If tea had an ancient origin story, it would likely be here, or in the Tibetan or in the Sichuan steppe. This is where you get the most biological diversity. This is where you get ancient trees, and I actually have a story about this. So, going back up to some of my experiences, I visited a friend in Linsong when I was in Linsong. He makes Bingdao tea. His name is Gao Lei, and he's done Bingdao for a really long time. He's born there. Wasn't a lot of money there until recently. Now there's a sick ton of it. But when I visited him in Linsong, he took me up to the Dashui Shan. And the Dashui Shan is one of the highest mountains in the region, and we hiked it, and it was a really cool hike. But again, I get that same feeling I get in the north of Yunnan where everything's primeval, everything's ancient, everything's huge. And this mountaintop, I've never seen tea trees so big. They're absolutely, absolutely massive, bigger than all the other trees in this region. Incredible. And of course, they're not actually the modern Camellia sinensis cultivar, varietal, they're ancient ancestors of the tea plant. And so seeing this, seeing, a 3,000-year-old tree that has the same leaf structure, the same bark structure as the regular tea plant, and is heralded as the father of all tea, I went up and I put my hands on it. I have a leaf from this tree in the back of my phone. It took like 2.5 hours, 3 hours to hike to get there. There are Chinese rangers there protecting the forest, protecting these trees, making sure nobody comes and harvests them. Gaole himself said, this is actually slightly poisonous. You're not supposed to drink this tea, but it's ancestor of all of the other teas. There were like 3 ancient tea ancestors there, but the oldest one supposedly is 3,000 years old, and it was beautiful. And again, like, I've traveled around China in Zhejiang and other regions looking for wild trees, tea trees, and I see quite a few, but there's always that little difference where I'm like, I'm not sure this is the same cultivar, the same varietal. And so that's certainly something that I saw personally here in Yunnan, here in the Dashui Shan, in Linsang, these ancient ancestors of modern tea. And so for me, a lot of these things are making it clear in my mind that it's very likely that tea did originate in this region, in this origin, because I see older trees, I see larger trees, I see more wild trees, wild diversity of the tea type plants and stuff in this region. And then like everything else, like my friend who really loves the fauna and the flora here, different taxonomy of milkweeds and orchids, and it all flows down from this kind of steppe, from this Huangdong mountain region. The Hengduan mountain region. And one other thing I would like to talk about is an interesting point that Lu Yu did not mention Pu'er tea in his tea classic. One interesting part about this is at that time in the Tang Dynasty, this area of Yunnan was not considered part of the Tang Empire. It was not even China. And so if you're doing a treatise on Chinese tea, you don't want to mention the neighbor's tea, the border kingdom tea. There were mentions in the Tang Dynasty of tea from this region, right? There's tea from the mountain of the Silver City, which is modern day Pu'er. And this is the tea that is drunk with pepper and ginger and cinnamon. And so, I'm happy enough to say that yes, tea existed in Yunnan and was being drunk in the time of the Tang Dynasty, as were, along with many of the other famous teas. Though I can't make the concrete declaration that yes, this is the origin of all tea, or that Yunnan has, an origin of drinking Pu'er tea from 2000 or 200 AD. That's still a little aqueous, but evidence that there are ancient trees here. The fauna, the flora, the diversity can accept it, can create it. And that Pu'er has been around since at least the Yuan dynasty, exporting and pressing tea cakes. And that production really picked up in the Ming dynasty, and it's not until the Qing dynasty that it kind of changes its route from over the Tibetan steppe to the northeastern imperial court of modern-day Beijing and the Qianlong emperor himself. So this kind of is what I would say brings us up into the modern or the pre-modern history of Pu'er tea, which I can cover in the next episode. This episode was all about a geographical survey of Yunnan, why Yunnan's amazing, why I love Yunnan, and why the teas from Yunnan are very unique too, because these teas are a reflection of the environment. Every mountain, every village, every region, their teas taste different. These tea gardens were created before the modern cloning practices, so you're not getting identical tea bushes in every region. It's all seed cultivated, seed propagated, and so you get this genetic diversity here as well. And the different soil types, we'll talk about soil types maybe later next time, but Yunnan has this really nice rich red soil. So thank you guys for listening to this rather educational episode of Tea Soup. I hope you like some of the stories. In the next episode, I'll talk about kind of the modern Pu'er tea. What Pu'er tea as we know it, the pressed tea cakes, the wrappers, the numbers, the different factories that made what, the how to read the numbers, the 7542 and stuff like that. And I'll talk about some modern trends in Pu'er production. So thank you guys for listening to this episode of Tea Soup. Again, this is Derek from One Over Tea and from Tao Teaver, and until next time, guys, brew happy.